Imagine being told that your entire life, your body, your choices, even your identity belonged not to you, but to a temple. In ancient Mesopotamia, temple prostitution is often misunderstood, romanticized, or even debated by historians. But what if the reality was far more complicated and far harsher than we think? Tonight, we're stepping back thousands of years to uncover what life may have actually been like for women tied to these sacred institutions. And why, for many, it wasn't a privilege, it was a burden. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy.com fascinating history like this. Subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, hidden, and often uncomfortable truths of the past. And let me know in the comments what historical topic should we explore next. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's uncover a side of ancient history most people never hear about. Night falls slowly over Ur. Not the kind of night we know today. No streetlights, no glowing windows, no distant hum of electricity. Just darkness, thick and heavy, settling over mud brick walls and narrow streets like a blanket no one asked for. The last light of the sun fades behind the flat horizon. For a moment, everything turns gold, then red, then gone. One by one, small points of light appear. Oil lamps. They flicker to life inside homes, in alleyways, and most of all inside the temple complex. From a distance, the temple doesn't look peaceful. It looks alive, like something breathing in the dark. At the center rises the Great Ziggurat, a massive staircase of stone and clay, climbing toward the sky as if humans once believed they could just walk up and knock on a god's door. Up there, somewhere in the darkness, the gods are watching. At least, that's what everyone believes. And down below, in the courtyards and chambers of the temple, people are still working, especially the women. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. Soft footsteps on packed earth, the faint clink of pottery, low voices speaking words meant for divine ears, not human ones. Somewhere, a stringed instrument hums gently, the sound drifting through the warm night air like a lullaby. It feels calm, peaceful even. But it isn't. Because for some of the women inside those walls, this is not just a place of worship. It's their whole life, and not always by choice. Now, when people today hear about women in ancient temples, especially in a place like Mesopotamia, there's a certain idea that comes to mind. You've probably heard it before. Temple prostitutes. Yeah, that phrase. It shows up in documentaries, articles, random TikToks, and comment sections where someone is way too confident about ancient history. The story usually goes like this. Women served the goddess by sleeping with strangers as part of some kind of sacred ritual. It sounds dramatic, a little shocking. Honestly, kind of made for viral content. But here's the thing. History is rarely that simple, and usually, when something sounds a bit too neat, or a bit too scandalous, it's worth slowing down and asking a better question. What was really going on? Because standing here, in the quiet night of Ur, looking at those temple walls glowing in the dark, it doesn't feel like a place built around something casual or chaotic. It feels controlled, ordered, serious. The kind of place where every movement matters. Every word matters. Every person has a role. And stepping outside that role is not a small mistake. It's a problem, and a dangerous one. Inside the temple complex, life follows rhythms older than memory. The rising and setting of the moon, the cycles of planting and harvest, the rituals that must be performed at exactly the right time, in exactly the right way, or else, well, no one really wants to find out what happens if you get it wrong. The gods here are not distant ideas. They are present. They eat. They drink. They demand attention, and the temple is their house, which means the people inside it. They are not just workers. They are staff, servants, caretakers, representatives, and for the women living here, that role can be complicated. Some are born into powerful families and sent here as part of tradition. Others arrive because their families can't afford to keep them. Some might even believe, at least at first, that they've been chosen for something important, something sacred. But belief and reality don't always match. Imagine being brought here as a young girl. Maybe you remember your home. Maybe you don't. Maybe you had a choice. Maybe you didn't. Either way, the gates close behind you, and suddenly your world becomes smaller, more structured, more watched. Your days are no longer your own. They belong to the temple, to the rituals, to the expectations that stretch back hundreds of years. You wake when you're told. You work where you're told. You speak when it's allowed. And always, there is this quiet pressure in the background, the sense that you are being observed, not just by priests or supervisors, but by something bigger, something invisible, something divine. Now, to be fair, not every woman here lives the same life. That's one of the first things we need to understand, and we'll get into it more later. Some women in the temple hold real power, influence, status. They can manage land, oversee workers, even interact with kings. From the outside, it might look like a pretty good deal, but for others, it's different, much different. And even for the ones with status, that power comes with conditions, strict ones, because in a place like this, your identity is not really yours. It belongs to the temple, to the God you serve, to the system that decides where you stand and what you're worth. And stepping outside that system, that's not just frowned upon, it can ruin you. So when people casually throw around the idea of temple prostitution, like it was some kind of normal, everyday thing, it misses something important. It flattens a whole world into a single, catchy phrase. A phrase that says more about modern imagination than ancient reality. Because the truth, whatever it turns out to be, is tied to power, control, belief, and survival. Not just sex, not just scandal, but something quieter, something heavier, something that doesn't always show up in bold headlines, and that's what makes it worth exploring. So tonight, as the lamps flicker and the city of yours settles into darkness, we're going to take a closer look inside those temple walls. We're going to follow the lives of the women who lived there, not as myths, not as stereotypes, but as people. People with routines, pressures, fears, and maybe sometimes small moments of peace. We'll look at where the idea of temple prostitution even came from. We'll ask whether it was ever real or if it's something that grew out of misunderstanding, mistranslation, or maybe even a bit of ancient gossip that got way out of hand. And more importantly, we'll ask a bigger question. Even if the stories aren't true in the way people think, what was it actually like to live this life? Because you don't need dramatic myths to understand that something could be difficult. Sometimes all you need is a quiet night, a set of closed gates, and a life that was never fully your own. The lamps burn low, the music fades, and somewhere inside the temple, a woman finishes her work for the night, knowing that tomorrow will look almost exactly the same. Not terrible, not peaceful, just fixed. And that might be the most important detail of all. let's be honest for a second. If you clicked on a video with the words "temple prostitute" in the title, you probably already had a picture in your head. Most people do. It's usually something like this: a grand ancient temple, maybe in a place like Babylon, a line of women waiting, a ritual, a stranger, money exchanged, something sacred but also kind of uncomfortable. It's a story that feels very specific, very confident, like it must come from somewhere real, and in a way, it does. But not in the way people think, because a lot of this idea, this very vivid, very persistent idea can be traced back to one man, a traveler, a storyteller, a guy who, let's just say, didn't always fact-check everything. His name was Herodotus. Now, Herodotus lived around the 5th century BCE. He's often called the father of history, which is a bit generous sometimes. He wrote about different cultures, places, and traditions he encountered or heard about during his travels, and to be fair, he did preserve a lot of valuable information. But he also loved a good story, and occasionally he repeated things that were second-hand, or misunderstood, or just plain wrong. One of those stories, Babylon. According to Herodotus, there was a custom in Babylon where every woman, at least once in her life, had to go to the temple of a goddess and have sex with a stranger as part of a sacred ritual. Yeah, that's the origin of the whole temple prostitution idea. It's not something pulled from Mesopotamian records themselves. It's not written clearly in local inscriptions. It comes from an outsider, describing what he thought he saw, what someone told him they saw, and for a long time, people just accepted it, because, honestly, it sounded believable enough. Ancient world, check. Exotic culture, check. Strange religious practice, double check. It fit the narrative people already had in their heads about distant civilizations being mysterious, dramatic, and just a little bit wild. So the story stuck. It got repeated in books, taught in classrooms, passed along like a historical fact. But here's where things start to shift. Modern historians, people who actually spend their lives reading clay tablets, translating ancient languages, and piecing together daily life from tiny fragments, started asking a simple question: where is the evidence? Not stories, not second-hand reports, actual Mesopotamian records. Because here's the thing about Mesopotamia. They wrote everything down: contracts, laws, taxes, recipes, complaints, even letters that basically say, "Hey, why haven't you sent the grain yet?" If something as major as a universal ritual involving women and temple sex was happening, you'd expect it to show up somewhere in all that writing. But it doesn't, at least not in the way Herodotus described. Instead, what we find is something much more complicated. We find records of temple women, yes, different categories, different roles, different rules, some with high status, some with very little. We find rituals, ceremonies, offerings to gods. We even find references to sexuality in religious contexts, but usually symbolic, controlled, and tied to specific events, not everyday practice. What we don't find is clear, consistent evidence that every woman in a city like Babylon had to perform this kind of ritual. And that's a big gap. Because when historians see a claim like Herodotus, a very specific, very dramatic claim, and then they look at the local evidence and find silence, that raises questions, big ones. So what happened? Well, there are a few possibilities. One is simple misunderstanding. Herodotus might have seen a ritual or heard about one and interpreted it through his own cultural lens. What made sense in his world might not match what was actually happening in Mesopotamia. Another possibility is exaggeration. Maybe there was a small, specific practice involving certain women in certain contexts, and over time, it got blown up into something much larger. You know how stories go. Someone says, "This happened once," and a few retellings later it becomes, "This happens to everyone all the time." And then there's the possibility of bias. Ancient writers, just like modern ones, had opinions. They compared other cultures to their own. Sometimes they judged. Sometimes they misunderstood. Sometimes they just liked telling stories that made their audience go, "Wait, they do what?" And honestly, that hasn't changed much. But here's where it gets interesting. Even though modern scholarship largely questions or rejects the idea of widespread temple prostitution in Mesopotamia, the myth is still everywhere. It shows up in documentaries, in articles, in casual conversations, in YouTube comments where someone confidently explains ancient history after watching half a video. It's persistent, and that persistence tells us something important. People are drawn to simple explanations, especially ones that feel dramatic or a little shocking. Temple prostitution is a neat phrase. It wraps a complex system of religion, labor, gender roles, and power into two words that are easy to remember. But real history, it doesn't like being neat. It's messy, contradictory, full of gaps and uncertainties. And sometimes, the truth is less dramatic, but more unsettling. Because if the story isn't about some clear, defined ritual that everyone understood, then what was life like for these women? What did they actually do? What choices did they have? What pressures were they under? Those questions don't have quick, catchy answers. They take time, they take context, and they take a willingness to sit with something that isn't entirely clear. So as we move forward, it's important to keep one thing in mind. We're not just trying to debunk a myth, we're trying to replace it with something better, something closer to reality, even if that reality is quieter, less dramatic, and maybe, in its own way, more uncomfortable. Because it's one thing to imagine a strange ritual that happens once. It's another thing entirely to understand a system that shapes someone's entire life. And that's what we're really looking at here. Not just a story about what people think happened, but a deeper look at what it actually meant to live inside those temple walls. Without the myths, without the shortcuts, just the slow, complicated truth. Before we go any further, we need to zoom out a bit, because if you really want to understand what life was like for women inside a temple, you have to understand the world outside it and that world. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't simple, it was loud, busy, crowded, and constantly balancing on the edge of survival. We're in Mesopotamia, a word that literally means he land between rivers. Those rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they are the reason anything exists here at all. Without them, this place is just dry land and dust with them. It becomes one of the first places on Earth. Here cities rise, writing develops, and people start organizing themselves into something that looks a lot like civilization, but don't picture green paradise. This isn't some peaceful farming village with birds chirping in the background. The rivers are unpredictable. Foods can come too early, or too late, or not at all. Crops depend on timing, and timing is something no one fully controls. So life here is always a bit uncertain, a bit tense. You work hard because you have to. Now, step into a city like Babylon. It's crowded, narrow streets, mud brick houses packed close together. The air is warm, sometimes heavy, carrying the smell of cooking animals. And river water people are everywhere. Merchants calling out prices, farmers bringing goods, workers hauling materials, children running through spaces that are probably too small for running. It's alive, and above it, all rising over the rooftops, you see it. The temple, always the temple. It's not just a religious building. It's the center of everything. Economically, politically, socially, it all circles back to that one place. Think of it less like a church, ND, more like a combination of government office, warehouse, workplace, and spiritual headquarters, all rolled into one. Need food distributed. Temple. Need land managed. Temple. Need rituals performed to keep the gods happy so the river doesn't destroy everything. Definitely the temple, and this is where things start to connect, because the women we're talking about, they're not existing on the edge of society. They're right in the middle of it, inside the most important institution in the city. Now, that might sound like a good thing, and sometimes it was, but it also meant something else. It meant being part of a system that was bigger than any one person. A system that didn't really care about individual freedom the way we think about it today. Because in Mesopotamia, identity is tied to your role, your family, your job, your place in the hierarchy. You're not just you. You're someone's daughter, someone's worker, someone's servant, someone's representative. And if you're part of the temple, you belong to the god. That's not metaphorical, that's literal. The god of the temple, whether it's Inanna or another deity, is believed to actually reside there, not symbolically, not spiritually, in some abstract way physically. The temple is their house, their home, and everything inside it is theirs, including the people. So when a woman enters temple life, she's not just taking on a job, she's entering into a relationship with a divine being. A relationship that comes with expectations, duties, and restrictions, and a level of seriousness that's hard to overstate. Because if something goes wrong, a ritual is missed. If an offering is incorrect, if the god is displeased, the consequences aren't just personal, they're communal. People believe the whole city could suffer. Bad harvest, flooding, disease, so the pressure is constant, not loud, not dramatic, just always there, in the background. Like a low hum you can't turn off, and this pressure shapes everything. It shapes how temples are run. It shapes how people behave, and it shapes the lives of the women inside those walls in ways that aren't always obvious at first. Now, Outside the temple, life continues in its usual rhythm. Markets open at sunrise. Deals are made. Arguments happen. People laugh, complain, live their lives, but inside the temple, it's different, more controlled, more structured. Time moves according to ritual, not convenience. The hour schedules, yes, but they're tied to things like the phases of the moon, the timing of ceremonies, the needs of the god. It's not about what you feel like doing. It's about what needs to be done, and that difference matters, because it creates a kind of separation, a quiet line between the world outside and the world inside. From the outside, the temple might look impressive, powerful, even honorable. From the inside, it can feel limiting, predictable, sometimes suffocating, and yet, for many women, there isn't really an alternative. Marriage is one path. Family life, children, managing a household. But that comes with its own expectations and limitations. Temple life is another path, and it can offer stability, food, shelter, even status, depending on your role. But it also means giving up something, choice, flexibility, a sense of personal direction. Because once you're in, you're in. So when we talk about why it might have sucked to live this kind of life, it's not just about any one thing. It's about the environment, the system, the way everything is structured to keep the machine running smoothly. Even if that means the people inside it have to adjust themselves to fit. And that's the world we're stepping into. Not a place of constant chaos or constant suffering, but a place where life is defined by roles, expectations, and a kind of quiet pressure that never really goes away. A place where the gods are close, the rules are strict, and the people, especially the women inside the temple, are expected to carry more than their share of the weight. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. This isn't just a story about individuals. It's a story about a system, a very old, very powerful system. And once you're part of it, it doesn't let go easily. To really understand temple life, you have to understand one simple thing. The gods were not distant. They weren't abstract ideas floating somewhere far away in the sky. They were here, close watching, living, in a very real sense, among the people, and that changes everything. Because in Mesopotamia, religion isn't something you do once a week. It's not a quiet moment of reflection before going back to normal life. It is life. Every success, every failure, every storm, every good harvested, all traces back to the gods. If something goes well, the gods are pleased. If something goes wrong, well, you probably did something wrong first. No pressure, right? Now, among all the gods in this world, one stands out when we talk about temple women. Her name is Inanna, also known later as Ishtar, and she is not a calm, gentle, predictable kind of goddess. She's complicated. She represents love, but also war, desire, but also destruction, fertility, but also chaos. Basically, she's the kind of deity you respect, and maybe fear a little. Actually, scratch that a lot. Because a nana isn't passive, she acts. She demands, she changes things, and if you're serving in her temple, you're not just performing tasks. You're maintaining a relationship with a force that people believe can shape reality itself. Now, imagine being a young woman in that environment. You're told that the goddess lives in the temple, not symbolically, not in spirit, actually lives there. Her statue isn't just a statue, it's her physical presence, her meals, prepared daily, her clothing carefully maintained, her space cleaned, arranged, respected at all times. Everything is done as if she might walk in at any moment, because, in a way, she already has. So when temple women carry out their duties, they're not just going through the motions, they're performing for a divine audience. Every movement matters, every word matters, and mistakes. Every word matters, and mistakes. Not ideal, actually. Very not ideal, because if the goddess is displeased, the consequences aren't just personal. They ripple outward. People believe she could affect crops, fertility, even the stability of the city itself. So the pressure isn't loud, but it's constant. Like someone always watching over your shoulder, except that someone controls basically everything. Now, temples are often described as houses of the gods, and that's not just poetic language. They function like houses, large ones, sure, but still houses. There are kitchens where food is prepared for the deity, storage rooms filled with offerings, grain oil, textiles, workspaces where goods are produced, sleeping quarters for the staff. It's a whole complex, a system, and at the center of it all is the god or goddess who owns everything, including, technically, the people working there. So when we talk about priests and priestesses, it's easy to imagine them as powerful figures, and some of them are, but they're also employees, caretakers, managers of divine property, and that includes the women in the temple. They're not just individuals, they're part of the god's household, which sounds important, and it is, but it also means their lives are tightly controlled, because you don't just casually do things in a god's house. You follow rules, very specific ones. There are rituals that have to be performed at exact times, offerings that have to be prepared in exact ways, songs that must be sung correctly, words that must be spoken precisely. It's less like casual worship, and more like a full-time job with extremely high stakes and no room for improvisation. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because while the gods are powerful, they're also human-like. They eat, they drink, they have emotions. They can be pleased, angered, jealous. They're not distant, perfect beings. They're relatable in a very intense way, which means serving them isn't just about respect. It's about managing a relationship, a delicate one, and for temple women, that relationship defines everything. It shapes their routines, their behavior, their identity. Because if you're assigned to serve a goddess like Inanna, you're expected to reflect something of her presence, her power, her role in the world, and that can come with expectations that are complicated, sometimes symbolic, sometimes deeply personal, and sometimes tied to rituals that we, looking back, don't fully understand. But what we do understand is this: being close to the gods doesn't necessarily mean being free. In fact, it often means the opposite. More responsibility, more restriction, more pressure to get everything right. Because when your daily life is tied to maintaining divine favor, there's no such thing as a day off. There's no moment where you can just relax and be yourself. You are always representing something bigger, something more important than you. And over time, that can wear on a person, even if they believe in what they're doing, even if they feel honored to be there, because belief doesn't erase pressure, it just gives it meaning. So when we look at temple women through this lens, we start to see something different. Not a group defined by one shocking idea or one misunderstood practice, but a group of individuals living inside a system where the line between human and divine is very thin, where their work is constant, their roles are fixed, and their lives are shaped by forces they can't really question. Not openly, anyway. Because questioning the system doesn't just mean questioning authority. It means questioning the gods, and that's not something you do lightly, if at all. So as the light deepens over the temple, and the last offerings are placed before the goddess, there's a quiet sense of completion. For now, because tomorrow, it all begins again. Same rituals, same expectations, same invisible presence, watching, waiting, demanding everything be done just right, and for the women inside those walls. That's not just a belief, it's their reality. By now, it might be tempting to imagine temple women as one single group. Same life, same role, same experience. But that's not how it worked. Not even close. If anything, the temple was more like a layered system, a hierarchy. Different roles stacked on top of each other, each with its own rules, privileges, and problems. So instead of one type of woman in the temple, there were many. And understanding that is key. Because some of them had status, some had comfort, and some didn't have much at all. Let's start at the top. There were high-ranking priestesses, often from powerful families. One of the most important roles was the Entua, kind of high priestess dedicated to a major deity, sometimes even linked to royal blood. These women could hold real influence. They managed property, oversaw temple operations, interacted with elites, sometimes even kings. From the outside, this might look like a pretty good position, and in some ways, it was. But there was a catch, actually. Several. Because becoming an Intu wasn't exactly a career choice you made after thinking it over. It was usually decided for you by your family, by political needs, by tradition. And once you stepped into that role, your life became very specific, highly controlled. For example, many high-ranking priestesses were expected to remain celibate, no marriage, no children. Their identity wasn't tied to a husband or a family. It was tied entirely to the god they served, which sounds honorable, until you think about what that means over a lifetime. No personal family, no stepping away, no changing your mind. You are the role, for as long as the system says you are. Now, move a little lower in the hierarchy, and you find another group, the Nadru women. These are interesting. They're often from wealthy families too, and they live in special communities connected to temples, like a kind of enclosed district. They don't marry, they don't have children, but they can own property, run businesses, lend money. So in some ways, they have more economic freedom than other women in society. Sounds like a decent trade-off, right? Well, not entirely. Because while they have economic agency, their personal lives are still tightly restricted. They're separated from broader society. Their social world is limited. And again, this isn't something they necessarily chose. It's a role assigned to them, a path set in motion by family decisions, long before they had a say. Now, as we move further down, things get less clear. There are categories like Pr0stitute, term that shows up in texts but doesn't come with a neat, simple definition. For a long time, people assumed this word referred to sacred prostitutes, but modern scholars aren't so sure. In fact, most now think that interpretation is probably wrong, or at least oversimplified. The word itself might just mean something like consecrated woman or holy woman, which is a lot less dramatic, but also a lot more vague, and that vagueness matters, because it shows how easy it is to take a label, misunderstand it, and build an entire story around it. Still, whatever their exact role, these women were part of the temple system, and like everyone else in that system, they operated under its rules. Then there were the lower-ranking workers, the ones who don't always get named in records, the ones who don't show up in big historical discussions. But they were there, a lot of them. They wove textiles, prepared food, cleaned spaces, assisted in rituals, handled the everyday tasks that kept the temple running. Without them, nothing works, but their lives much harder. Less status, less protection, less visibility, and probably less choice. Because for many of these women, temple life wasn't about honor or spiritual calling. It was about survival. Maybe their families couldn't support them. Maybe they were given to the temple as part of a debt. Maybe it was the only option available, and once they were in, that was it. Their labor belonged to the institution. Their time was scheduled, their movement controlled, and unlike the higher-ranking women, they didn't have wealth or influence to balance things out. So when we talk about temple women, we're really talking about a spectrum. At one end, women with power but strict limitations. At the other, women with very little power and even fewer options. And in between, a whole range of roles that don't fit neatly into modern categories. Which brings us back to that phrase again, temple prostitute. It flattens all of this, all these different lives, roles, experiences, and reduces them to one idea, one label, one assumption. But the reality, it's way more complex, and honestly, more interesting. Because instead of one shocking story, you get a system. A structure where women's lives are shaped by status, family, economics, and religion all at the same time. And that structure doesn't treat everyone equally, not even close. So some women might have found a kind of stability here, a place where they had purpose, routine, maybe even respect. Others, not so much. For them, the temple wasn't just a workplace. It was a boundary, a set of walls that defined where their life could go, where it couldn't. And once you see that, it changes the question a little. It's not just, were these women forced into one specific role? It's, what kind of life did each of them actually have inside this system? Because the answer isn't one thing, it's many, and not all of them are good. Some are complicated, some are restrictive, and some, quietly, without a lot of attention, are just hard. The kind of hard that doesn't show up in dramatic stories, but lasts a long time, day after day, inside the same walls, under the same rules, with very little room to be anything else. So how does someone end up here? That's the question that sits quietly behind everything we've talked about so far. Because temples don't just fill themselves with people. Every woman inside those walls had a beginning, a moment where her life changed direction. And most of the time, that decision wasn't really hers. In Mesopotamia, family isn't just important, it's everything. Your identity, your future, your place in society. It all starts there. So when a girl is sent to the temple, it usually begins with a family decision, not a personal calling, not a sudden spiritual awakening, a decision, sometimes practical, sometimes strategic, sometimes unavoidable. Let's start with the simplest version. A wealthy family. They have influence, resources, connections. Dedicating a daughter to the temple, especially in a high-status role, can actually be a smart move. It strengthens ties with religious institutions, adds prestige. In some cases, it even connects the family more closely to political power. So a girl might be chosen for this path early, raised with the expectation, prepared for it, told that this is an honor. And to be fair, in that context, it can be, but even then, it's still not really a choice. It's a role assigned long before she fully understands what it means. Now shift to a different situation. A family that's struggling, not starving, maybe but close. Resources are tight, opportunities limited. In that case, sending a daughter to the temple might be less about honor and more about survival. The temple can provide food, shelter, stability, one less mouth to feed at home. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a solution. And in a world where uncertainty is constant, stability, any kind of stability matters, then there are more difficult scenarios. Debt, obligations, situations where families owe something, money, labor, loyalty, and the temple becomes part of how that debt is managed. In these cases, a girl might be given to the temple not as a religious offering, but as part of a system of exchange. Not exactly voluntary, not exactly avoidable, just how things work. And that's the part that tends to get overlooked. Because when we talk about ancient systems, it's easy to imagine them as distant, almost symbolic. But for the people living inside them, they're very real, very immediate, and often very limiting. Now, imagine being that girl. You don't get a dramatic announcement, no big moment where everything changes at once. It's quieter than that. Maybe you're told gradually. Maybe it's just always been understood. Or maybe one day, the decision is simply made, and that's it. You leave home. You walk through the streets, familiar ones, that suddenly feel different. You pass people you know, places you recognize, and then you reach the temple. Those same walls we've been talking about. Tall, solid, unmoving. The gates open. You step inside, and just like that, your world shifts. Not all at once, but enough that you feel it. Because inside, things are different. The rhythms, the expectations, the rules, even the way people speak to you. You're no longer just a daughter. You're something else now. Something defined by the temple, by the god, by the role you're about to take on. And depending on where you fall in that hierarchy we talked about earlier, your experience from here will vary. If you're entering a higher status position, you might receive training, education, in rituals, language, proper behavior. You're shaped carefully, prepared to represent something important. If you're entering a lower ranking role, less ceremony, more work. You learn by doing, by watching, by being corrected when you get something wrong. And either way, there's one thing that becomes clear pretty quickly. This is not temporary. This isn't like trying something out and seeing if it fits. Once you're here, you're here. Your path is set, and that can be a strange feeling. Even if everything is calm, even if no one is being cruel, there's still this quiet realization that the future is narrowed, that the number of choices you have has decreased a lot. Now, that doesn't mean every girl felt unhappy. That's important to say. Some might have found comfort in the structure, in the predictability, in knowing exactly what was expected of them. Some might have taken pride in their role, especially if they were taught to see it as meaningful, even sacred. But even in those cases, there's still a layer underneath. Because adapting to a system isn't the same as choosing it. And over time, that difference can matter a lot, especially on the quiet days. The repetitive ones, when the routines feel less meaningful and more fixed. When you realize that outside those walls, life is still moving. People are making choices, starting families, changing paths, and you're on a track that was set for you long ago. So when we ask why this life might have been difficult, this is a big part of it. It starts early, before you fully understand, before you can really weigh the options, and once it begins, it doesn't really stop. The gates of the temple don't just separate space, they separate possibilities. Inside, everything is structured, defined, expected, and stepping outside that structure, that's not something most people get to do. So as the night settles again over the city, and the temple lamps flicker against those same unmoving walls, it's worth remembering this part of the story. Before the routines, before the roles, before the responsibilities, there was a beginning, a decision, and for many of these women, it wasn't theirs to make. So what does a normal day actually look like? Not the dramatic version, not the myth, just a regular day inside the temple. Well, first, there's no sleeping in. Sorry. The day starts early, really early, before the sun fully rises, when the air is still a little cooler and the city outside is just starting to wake up. Inside the temple, though, things are already moving. There are routines to follow, and those routines don't care if you're tired. You wake up when you're told. You get ready quickly. No long, relaxing mornings. No 5 more minutes. Ancient Mesopotamia was not built for that. And then the work begins. Now, depending on your role, your tasks might look a bit different, but most days follow a similar rhythm. For many women, especially those in lower ranking positions, the day is built around labor. Real, physical work. Weaving is a big one. Textiles were extremely important in Mesopotamia. Clothing, trade goods, offerings fabric was everywhere, and a lot of it was produced inside temple workshops. So you might spend hours at a loom, threading fibers, keeping patterns consistent, fixing mistakes, because mistakes mean wasted material, and wasted material is not appreciated. It's repetitive, quiet, the kind of task where time moves slowly, and your hands do most of the thinking. Then there's food preparation. Temples didn't just feed the people working there. They also prepared offerings for the gods. Bread, beer, grains, oils. Everything had to be made properly, carefully. You don't want to mess up a meal that's meant for a deity. That's not a great career move. So there are kitchens, busy and warm, where women measure, mix, bake, and prepare food throughout the day. Again, repetitive. Again, structured, but necessary. Then there are ritual duties. This is where things feel a bit different, more formal, more precise. Some women are responsible for assisting in ceremonies, bringing offerings, maintaining sacred spaces, helping prepare the statue of the deity, cleaning it, dressing it. making sure everything is in perfect order. Because the god or goddess is treated like a living presence, you don't rush through that. You don't improvise. You follow the steps exactly. And if you're involved in music or chanting, your role might be to perform during these rituals, playing instruments, singing hymns, creating the atmosphere that connects the physical world to the divine, which sounds kind of beautiful. And sometimes it probably was. A quiet moment, a shared rhythm, something that feels meaningful, even peaceful. But even those moments are structured, timed, expected. It's not creativity for its own sake. It's performance with a purpose. Now, here's something important. All of this, the weaving, the cooking, the rituals, it doesn't happen randomly. It follows a schedule, a very specific one. And that schedule isn't based on convenience. It's based on cycles. The moon, the seasons, the religious calendar. Certain days require certain rituals. Certain times require certain actions. Everything is planned. Everything is repeated. Which means your day isn't just about what you need to do, it's about when you need to do it. And there's not a lot of flexibility there. You don't really get to say, I'll do this later. Later might not exist. Now, let's talk about movement. Because this is where things start to feel a bit tighter. Inside the temple, your freedom to move around is limited. You go where your role allows you to go. You stay where you're supposed to stay. You don't just wander off to explore. This isn't a campus. It's a controlled space, and depending on your position, you might rarely leave it. Some women lived almost entirely within temple grounds. Their world was contained, defined by walls, courtyards, and workspaces. And while that might feel normal over time, it also means there's a kind of separation from the outside world. Life continues out there, but in here, things stay the same, day after day. Now, add one more layer to all of this. Observation. You're not working alone. There are supervisors, higher-ranking officials, people responsible for making sure everything runs smoothly. And they're watching, not in a dramatic, intimidating way all the time, but enough that you're aware of it. Enough that you adjust your behavior. You stay focused. You follow instructions. You don't take unnecessary risks, because mistakes can have consequences, and not just small ones. Depending on the situation, getting something wrong, especially in a ritual context, can be serious. So over time, you learn to be careful, consistent, predictable, which is exactly what the system wants. Now, somewhere in all of this, there are small moments of pause, short breaks, quick conversations, maybe a shared joke between tasks, a little bit of humanity slipping through the structure. Because even in the most controlled environments, people are still people. They find ways to connect, to cope, to make things a little lighter. Maybe someone complains about the workload. Maybe someone quietly laughs at something they're not supposed to laugh at. Nothing big, just small moments that remind you that you're not alone. But those moments are brief, because the work doesn't stop for long. By the time the sun starts to go down, the day isn't necessarily over. There are evening rituals, final tasks, preparations for the next day. And only when everything is done, when the last offering is placed, the last tool is put away, the last instruction followed, do things finally slow down. You rest, but even rest feels structured, temporary, because tomorrow, it's the same schedule, the same tasks, the same expectations. And after a while, that repetition becomes the rhythm of your life. Not exciting, not chaotic, just steady. And here's the thing, there's nothing obviously terrible about any single part of this day. Weaving isn't terrible. Cooking isn't terrible. Even rituals, in the right context, can feel meaningful. But when you put it all together day after day, with limited choice, limited movement, and constant expectations, it becomes something else, something heavier. A life that isn't defined by big, dramatic moments, but by routine, structure, and the quiet understanding that this is what your days will look like. For a long time, maybe your whole life. And that kind of predictability, it can be comforting, or it can feel like being stuck, depending on who you are, and how much choice you had in the first place. Alright, this is the part everyone's been waiting for. The phrase, the idea, the thing that shows up in titles, thumbnails, and comment sections like it's an established fact. Sacred prostitution. So let's slow this down, because this is where things get messy, and honestly, kind of fascinating. Now, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of this idea comes from one main source, Herodotus. He described a custom in Babylon where women were required, at least once in their lives, to go to a temple and have sex with a stranger as part of a religious ritual. That's the claim. Simple, clear, and very, very memorable. The kind of story that sticks. But here's the problem. When modern historians started digging into actual Mesopotamian evidence, real records from places like Babylon, they ran into a weird situation. They couldn't find proof of this practice, not in the way Herodotus described it. And that's a big deal. Because Mesopotamians were not shy about writing things down. They recorded laws, transactions, rituals, even arguments. If there was a widespread, mandatory practice involving every woman and temple sex, you'd expect at least something in the records. A law mentioning it, a contract referencing it, a complaint about it, because people complain about everything. But there's nothing that clearly lines up with Herodotus' version of events. Instead, what we find is something quieter, more complicated, and a lot less dramatic. We find references to temple women, different types, different roles. We find religious rituals, yes. We find symbolism connected to fertility, love, and divine relationships. But we don't find a system where every woman is required to participate in ritual sex. So what happened? How did this story become so widely accepted? Well, let's break it down. First, there's the issue of interpretation. Herodotus was an outsider. He was observing or hearing about a culture that wasn't his own. Different language, different customs, different assumptions. So it's entirely possible that he saw something and misunderstood it, or heard about something and interpreted it through his own cultural lens. For example, imagine seeing a ritual where a woman interacts with a stranger in a formal setting. Without context, that could look like something very different from what it actually is. Now add translation on top of that. Words don't always map neatly between languages. A term that means consecrated woman in one language might get interpreted as something else entirely in another, especially if the translator already has certain expectations. And over time, those small shifts in meaning can turn into big changes in narrative. Then there's exaggeration. Let's be honest, people have always loved telling stories that grab attention. If there was a rare or symbolic ritual involving a small group of women, it could easily be turned into something much larger in retelling. This happens sometimes becomes this happens often. This happens to a few people becomes this happens to everyone. And once that version takes hold, it spreads, especially if it's the more interesting version. Now, add one more layer: bias. Ancient Greek writers often compared other cultures to their own. Sometimes they admired them, sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they described them in ways that made them seem more exotic or unusual, because that's what their audience found interesting. So a story like this, it fits. It paints Babylon as mysterious, different, a little shocking, and that makes it memorable. But memorable doesn't always mean accurate. Now, fast forward a few thousand years, that story gets picked up again and again and again. Scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries repeat it. Books include it. Documentaries mention it. It becomes one of those facts that everyone kind of knows, without necessarily questioning where it came from. And once something reaches that point, it's hard to undo, because people don't just remember the source. They remember the idea, and the idea is simple, catchy, easy to explain. Temple prostitution. 2 words, done. But real history, it doesn't work like that. It resists being simplified, because when you actually look at the evidence from Mesopotamia, what you see is not a single practice. It's a system, a complex one, with different types of women, different roles, different rules, some connected to ritual, some connected to labor, some connected to status and power. And yes, there are moments where sexuality and religion intersect, but not in the way the popular story suggests, not as a universal, required act for every woman, not as a casual, everyday practice. Instead, what scholars now think is that if sexual rituals existed, they were likely rare, highly controlled, symbolic, and limited to specific contexts like royal ceremonies or mythological reenactments. Not something that defined the daily lives of most temple women, which is actually kind of important, because it shifts the focus. Instead of asking, did these women perform this one shocking act, we start asking better questions, like, what were their actual responsibilities? What kind of control did they have over their lives? What pressures were they under? What choices were available to them? And when you start asking those questions, the picture that emerges is less sensational, but more real, and honestly, more uncomfortable. Because it's one thing to imagine a dramatic ritual happening once. It's another thing to understand a life shaped by routine, restriction, and limited autonomy. That's harder to turn into a headline, but it's also closer to the truth. Now, here's the interesting part. Even though modern historians largely agree that the idea of widespread sacred prostitution in Mesopotamia is probably a misunderstanding, the myth hasn't gone away. It's still out there, still being repeated, still showing up in content, discussions, and casual explanations. And that tells us something, not just about ancient history, but about how we think about history. We like stories that are easy to understand. We like clear categories. We like things that feel dramatic or surprising. And when we find a story that fits those preferences, we tend to hold on to it, even when the evidence gets a little shaky, or a lot shaky. But here's the trade-off. When we hold on to the simple version, we lose the complexity, we lose the nuance, and we lose the chance to understand what life was actually like for the people living it. So if we let go of the myth even just for a moment, we can start to see something else. a system where women's lives were shaped by family decisions, economic realities, and religious structures. A system where roles were assigned early and rarely changed. A system that didn't need dramatic rituals to be restrictive, because the restriction was already built in, quietly, day after day. And that's where the real story is, not in the idea of a single, shocking practice, but in the everyday reality of living inside a structure that defines who you are, what you do, and how much control you have over your own life. So as we move forward, keep that in mind. We're not chasing a myth anymore. We're looking at something more grounded, more complex, and, in a quieter way, more revealing. Because sometimes, the truth isn't louder than the myth. It's just deeper. So, if the whole "every woman must sleep with a stranger" thing isn't really backed by evidence, does that mean sex had nothing to do with temples at all? Not exactly. Because here's where things get a little more nuanced, a little more complicated, and honestly, a bit more interesting. Sex, in the world of Mesopotamia, wasn't just personal. It could also be symbolic, political, even cosmic, in a strange way. And nowhere is that clearer than in something called the sacred marriage ritual. Now, this wasn't an everyday event. It wasn't something happening all the time in temple courtyards. This was rare, formal, highly controlled, and very, very important. The basic idea goes like this. The king, yes, the actual ruler of the city, would participate in a ritual that symbolized a union with the goddess, usually Inanna. But here's the key detail. The goddess wasn't physically present, obviously, so someone had to represent her, and that someone was often a high-ranking priestess. Now, depending on the time period and the interpretation, this ritual may have involved an actual physical act, or it may have been more symbolic. Scholars still debate the exact nature of it, but either way, the meaning behind it is what matters. This wasn't about romance, not even close. It was about power, legitimacy, control. The union between the king and the goddess symbolized harmony between the divine world and the human world. Basically, it was a way of saying, the gods approve of this king, and in a society where divine approval meant everything. That's a big deal, a very big deal. Now, let's pause for a second and think about the woman involved, because it's easy to focus on the king here. He's the visible figure, the one history tends to remember. But the priestess, she's the one representing the goddess, which sounds powerful, and in some ways, it is. She's central to the ritual, essential. Without her, the whole thing doesn't work. But again, we have to ask the same question we've been asking this whole time. How much choice did she really have? Because this isn't a casual situation. This is a state-level ritual, planned, expected, loaded with meaning. There's pressure from every direction, religious, political, social, and stepping back from that kind of expectation, probably not an option. So even in this moment, this very visible, very symbolic moment of importance, the dynamic is still shaped by the same system. Roles are assigned, expectations are set, and individuals move within those boundaries. Now, outside of these rare ceremonies, there are also small ones, of other ways that sexuality and religion might have intersected. But again, nothing like the broad, everyday practice people often imagine. Some texts use language that connects love, fertility, and divine favor. Certain hymns to Inanna are, let's just say, not subtle. They celebrate desire, passion, union, but these are poetic, symbolic, part of a larger religious framework, not instruction manuals for daily behavior. And that distinction matters, because it shows that sexuality wasn't ignored or hidden in Mesopotamian religion. It was acknowledged, even celebrated in certain contexts. But it was also controlled, framed, placed within specific boundaries, not something that just happened freely inside temple walls. Now, here's where things can feel a bit confusing, because when modern people look back at these kinds of rituals or texts, there's a tendency to interpret them through a very direct lens. If it mentions sex, it must be literal. If it's tied to a temple, it must be a regular practice. But ancient cultures didn't always separate the symbolic and the literal the way we do. A ritual could represent something without being about personal experience. A role could carry meaning without reflecting everyday life. So when we hear about a sacred marriage, it's not the same as imagining two individuals making a personal choice. It's more like a performance, a reenactment, a carefully structured event designed to communicate something bigger than the people involved. And that something bigger, it usually had to do with stability, fertility, order, the idea that the world was functioning as it should. Now, does that make it easier for the people involved? Not necessarily, because even symbolic roles can carry real pressure, real expectations, and real consequences, especially when those roles are tied to power. Because let's be clear, this isn't just religion, it's politics. The temple and the state are deeply connected. The king needs the temple supports the king, and rituals like this help reinforce that relationship. So the priestess involved isn't just participating in a religious act. She's part of a system that helps maintain the structure of the entire society. No big deal. Just the stability of civilization resting quietly on your shoulders. Now, to be fair, not every temple woman was involved in anything like this. In fact, most weren't. For the majority, daily life looked much more like what we talked about in the last chapter work. Routine, structure. But the existence of these rituals shows something important. It shows that sexuality, when it did appear in temple contexts, was not random, not casual, not widespread in the way people often assume. It was specific, controlled, and tied to power. Which brings us back to the bigger picture, because when people hear temple prostitution, they imagine something chaotic, unstructured, almost loose. But what we're actually seeing is the opposite. A system that carefully defines when, where, and how certain things happen. A system that assigns roles and expects them to be fulfilled. A system where even the most intimate or symbolic acts are part of a larger structure. And within that structure, individual choice is limited again. That pattern keeps showing up. Whether we're talking about daily labor, entry into temple life, or rare ceremonial roles, the same theme runs through everything. Control, expectation, assignment. So yes, sex and power did intersect in certain ways, but not in the way the myth suggests. Not as a widespread, everyday practice, and not as something driven by personal freedom. Instead, it appears in moments where the stakes are highest, where the meaning is symbolic, and where the individuals involved are part of something much larger than themselves, which, if you think about it, fits everything we've seen so far. Because this isn't a story about chaos, it's a story about structure. A very tight, very controlled structure. And for the women inside it, that structure shapes everything. Even the moments that, from the outside, might look powerful, Because power in this system doesn't always mean freedom. Sometimes, it just means a different kind of responsibility. By this point, a pattern is probably starting to feel familiar. Structure, routine, expectation, and underneath all of it, control. Not loud, aggressive control. Not the kind that shows up with constant shouting or visible force. Something quieter, more systematic, more built in. Because in a place like Mesopotamia, you don't always need to enforce rules loudly when everyone already knows them. And nowhere is that more obvious than in how temple women were expected to behave, especially when it came to purity. Now, purity here doesn't just mean cleanliness. It's bigger than that. It's about being in the right state, physically, socially, and symbolically to perform your role. Think of it like being ritually correct, and that status. It had to be maintained, carefully, constantly. Because once again, this isn't just about you. It's about the God, and anything that disrupts that connection. That's a problem. So there are rules, a lot of them. Some are practical. Wash before rituals. Wear the correct clothing. Handle sacred objects properly. Makes sense. But others go deeper. They shape your personal life, your relationships, your body. For example, some temple women, especially higher-ranking ones, were expected to remain celibate. No marriage, no children. Their identity was tied entirely to the deity they served, which again might sound honorable. Until you think about what that actually means over time. No family of your own. No personal legacy in the usual sense. No stepping outside that role and deciding, actually, I'd like something different, because that option isn't really on the table. Now, not every woman in the temple had to follow the same rules. That's important. Some roles allowed marriage, some didn't. Some had stricter expectations, others had slightly more flexibility. But overall, the system leaned toward restriction, toward defining what was acceptable and what wasn't, and making sure people stayed within those boundaries. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because these rules weren't just enforced from the outside. They were internalized. Over time, you don't just follow the rules because someone tells you to. You follow them because they become part of how you think, part of how you understand your place in the world. You don't step out of line not just because you might get in trouble, but because it feels wrong, out of order, like breaking something bigger than yourself. And that's a powerful kind of control, because it doesn't require constant supervision. It runs on belief. Now, of course, there was supervision too. Temple life wasn't a free-for-all. There were hierarchies, officials, people responsible for making sure everything stayed in order. And if something went wrong, there were consequences. We know this from legal texts, like those associated with Code of Hammurabi. These laws don't just deal with crime in the modern sense. They deal with behavior, reputation, social roles. For temple women, especially those in specific positions, stepping outside expected behavior could lead to serious punishment. Loss of status, removal from position, public consequences. And in a society where reputation is everything, that matters a lot. Because your role isn't just what you do. It's who you are. So losing it, that's not just a job change. It's a complete shift in identity. Now, let's talk about movement again. Because control isn't just about behavior. It's about space, where you can go, where you can't. And for many temple women, movement was limited. You don't just leave the temple whenever you feel like it. You don't wander through the city freely. Your world is defined by specific areas, courtyards, workspaces, living quarters, and while that might feel normal after a while, it also creates a kind of quiet isolation. The outside world becomes distant, not physically far but socially and psychologically separated. Life is happening out there, families growing, people making choices, but inside, things stay the same, structured, controlled. Now, let's add one more layer to this. Visibility, because even when you're inside the temple, you're not invisible. In fact, depending on your role, you might be very visible, especially during rituals, public ceremonies, moments where the temple interacts with the wider community. In those situations, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing the institution, the god, the system, and that comes with pressure. You have to look right, act right, be right, no slipping, no improvising, no off days, which, let's be honest, sounds exhausting, because humans have off days. That's kind of our thing. But in a system like this, you're expected to manage that, to keep things consistent, predictable, controlled. Now, here's the part that's easy to miss. None of this necessarily looks extreme from the outside. There's no single rule that stands out as obviously terrible. No one moment where you go, okay, that's clearly unbearable. Instead, it's the accumulation, the layering of expectations, the gradual narrowing of options, the quiet understanding that your life is defined by a set of rules you didn't create and can't easily change. And over time, that adds up. Because even if each individual rule makes sense within the system, together they create something else, a kind of pressure, not crushing, not overwhelming all at once, but steady, constant, always there. And that's what makes it difficult. Not because of one dramatic restriction, but because of how everything fits together, how every part of your life, your work, your behavior, your movement, your identity is shaped by the same structure, the same expectations, the same underlying idea that your role is more important than your personal freedom. Now, again, it's worth saying, not every woman experienced this in the same way. Some might have found meaning in it, a sense of purpose, a clear place in the world. And in a society where uncertainty is common, that kind of clarity can be comforting. But even then, there's still a trade-off, because clarity often comes at the cost of flexibility. And purpose, when it's assigned rather than chosen, can feel very different over time, especially when there's no easy way to step outside it. So when we talk about why this life might have been hard, this is a big part of it. Not chaos, not constant suffering, but control, quiet, structured, built into every part of the system. And once you're inside that system, it's not something you can just walk away from. You adjust, you adapt. You learn the rules so well that they start to feel natural. And in doing that, you become exactly what the system needs you to be, even if that means slowly setting aside parts of yourself along the way. So, was temple life actually good or bad? That's the question that starts to creep in around this point. Because up to now, it might feel a bit mixed. On one hand, we've seen restriction, control, limited choice. On the other hand, there's structure, stability, sometimes even status. So which is it? Privilege, or something closer to a prison? The answer, like most things in this world, is it depends, and not in a vague way. In a very real, very practical sense, your experience inside the temple depends heavily on where you sit in the hierarchy. Let's go back to the top for a second. High-ranking women like priestesses, tied to major deities such as Inanok, hold serious influence. They weren't just performing rituals. They were managing resources, land, workers, production. They could oversee entire sections of temple operations. And in a society where the temple is one of the most powerful institutions around, that's not nothing. That's real authority. These women might have access to better living conditions, better food, more privacy, more respect from others in the community. If you're looking at it from the outside, it can seem like a position of power. And in some ways, it is. But here's where it gets complicated. Because that power doesn't necessarily translate into freedom. You can have influence within a system and still be completely bound by it. Think of it like being very high up in a company you didn't choose to join, doing a job you can't leave. Sure, you might have authority. People might listen to you. But your path is still defined. Your role is still fixed. And the expectations placed on you are even higher than everyone else's. Because now, you're not just following the system. You're helping maintain it. So if something goes wrong, if a ritual fails, if the temple loses favor in the eyes of the community, that responsibility doesn't just disappear. It lands on people like you, which means the pressure is intense, quiet, again, but constant. Now, let's move down a level. Women like the Nadru, they're in an interesting position. They don't marry, they don't have children, but they can own property, run businesses, engage in economic activity in ways that many other women in society couldn't. So in terms of financial independence, they might actually be better off than average, which is kind of surprising. You don't usually expect temple life to come with business opportunities, but here we are. Still, that independence comes with boundaries. They often live in designated areas, separate from broader society. Their social world is limited, and their personal lives are structured. Again, there's that word. So while they might have more economic agency, they still don't have full personal freedom. It's like having access to resources, but within a system that decides how far you can go with them. Now, go further down. Lower-ranking women, workers, assistants, laborers. This is where things start to feel less balanced, because for many of these women, the benefits are smaller, and the restrictions still very much there. They work long hours, perform repetitive tasks, follow strict schedules, and unlike higher-ranking figures, they don't have influence to offset that. No real authority, no major decision-making power. They are essential to the system, but not elevated within it, and that's a tough place to be, because you're doing the work that keeps everything running, but you don't get much control over how that work is organized, or how your life is shaped around it. Now, here's where the privilege or prison question becomes more interesting, because it's not just about material conditions, it's about perspective. Imagine two different women. One is a high-ranking priestess, respected, influential, living in relative comfort. The other is a lower-ranking worker, limited status, heavy workload, less recognition. From the outside, it's easy to say the first woman has it better, and in many ways, she does. But both of them share something important. Neither of them chose this life freely, not in the way we think of choice today, and neither of them can easily leave. That's the key detail. Because privilege, when it exists inside a closed system, feels different. It's not the same as freedom. It's more like a better position within the same set of walls. You might have a larger space, more influence, better conditions, but the walls are still there, still defining the limits of your life. And that's where things start to feel a bit uncomfortable, because it challenges the way we usually think about status. We tend to assume that higher status equals better life, and sometimes that's true. But here, it's more complicated, because higher status also means more responsibility, more scrutiny, more pressure to perform your role perfectly, and less room to step outside expectations. So while a high-ranking priestess might have power, she also has less room to fail, less room to change direction, less room to say, I want something different. Now compare that to life outside the temple, marriage, family, household responsibilities, also structured, also limited in many ways, but still different. There's variation, movement, possibility, at least in some cases of shifting roles over time. Inside the temple, that flexibility is reduced. Your role is defined early, and it tends to stay that way. So even if the conditions are stable, even if they're comfortable, there's still that underlying reality that your life is not entirely your own. And that's where the prison part starts to come in. Not in a literal sense, no bars, no chains, but in a structural sense, a system that defines your boundaries so clearly that stepping outside them becomes almost unthinkable. And over time, that kind of structure can feel heavy, even if everything on the surface looks fine. Now, here's the subtle part. People adapt. That's what humans do. You get used to routines. You find meaning in roles. You build relationships within the system. You make it work because you have to. So not every day feels restrictive. Not every moment feels difficult. There are probably days that feel normal, even good. Moments of connection, small victories, quiet satisfaction in doing something well. And those moments matter. They make the system livable, but they don't change the underlying structure. They exist within it. So when we step back and look at the bigger picture, we see something that doesn't fit neatly into one category. Temple life isn't purely privilege, and it isn't purely suffering. It's a mix, a layered experience shaped by status, role, and expectation. But across all those layers, one thing stays consistent. Control, not always harsh, not always visible, but always present, defining the edges of what's possible. And once you see that, the question shifts again. It's not just, was this a good life or a bad life? It becomes, how much of this life was truly theirs? And the answer to that isn't very much, no matter where they stood in the hierarchy, because whether you were at the top, the middle, or the bottom, you were still inside the same system, the same walls, the same structure that decided what your life could be, and what it couldn't. Up until now, the temple might still feel like a religious space, rituals, gods, ceremonies, quiet chanting in the background. But if you strip that layer away even just a little, you start to see something else, something much more practical. The temple is a business, a massive one, and the women inside it, they're part of that system, whether they realize it or not. Now, when we think of ancient religion, it's easy to imagine something separate from economics, like belief on one side, and money on the other. But in Mesopotamia, those things are completely intertwined. You can't really separate them, because temples didn't just perform rituals, they owned land. A lot of land. Fields for growing crops, areas for grazing animals, workshops for producing goods, and all of that required labor, organization, management. So when you walk into a temple complex, you're not just entering a sacred space. You're entering a hub of production, a center of economic activity. Think warehouses filled with grain, storerooms stacked with oil jars, textiles being produced in large quantities, workers moving materials from one place to another, records being kept carefully in clay tablets. Who worked? Who produced what? Who received rations? Because yes, everything is tracked meticulously. And this is where things start to connect back to temple women. Because a huge part of this system relies on their labor. Not symbolic labor, not occasional tasks, daily, consistent, essential work. Weaving, cooking, preparing goods, maintaining spaces, assisting in production processes that feed into the temple's wealth. And here's the key detail. This work doesn't just stay inside the temple, it flows outward. Textiles can be traded, food can be distributed, resources can be managed and controlled. The temple isn't just supporting itself, it's influencing the entire local economy, which means the people working inside it are part of something much bigger. Now, let's talk about rations, because this is how a lot of temple workers were compensated. Not with coins, not with wages in the way we think of them today, but with goods, food, grain, oil, clothing, basic necessities. You work, you receive what you need to live. Simple, functional, but also limiting. Because this system doesn't leave much room for accumulation. You're not building personal wealth in the usual sense. You're sustaining yourself within the structure, which works as long as the structure is stable, as long as the temple continues to function, as long as you remain part of it. But step outside that system, and things get uncertain very quickly. Now higher-ranking women might have more access to resources. They might manage land, oversee production, even control certain economic decisions. But again, that control exists within the system. It's not independent. It's assigned, and it can be taken away. Which brings us back to something we've seen before. Power inside the temple doesn't always mean ownership. It means responsibility. You manage resources, but they belong to the god. You oversee labor, but you're still part of the hierarchy. You have influence, but only within defined boundaries, and those boundaries don't move easily. Now, for lower-ranking women, the situation is more straightforward and more difficult. They work, they produce, they receive rations, and that's about it. No upward mobility in the way we might imagine. No clear path to gaining independence. Their role is functional, necessary, but not flexible. And over time, that kind of structure can feel fixed, like being part of a machine. A very old, very efficient machine, where every part has a purpose, but no part gets to redesign the system. Now, here's something that often gets overlooked. The temple doesn't just rely on labor. It organizes it carefully, systematically. There are schedules, assignments, oversight, records of output. It's not random, it's managed. Which means that from a modern perspective, this starts to look a lot like an early form of institutional economy. centralized, structured, dependent on controlled labor. And again, the women inside the temple are a key part of that. Their work supports the system. Their presence helps maintain it. And their roles are designed to keep everything running smoothly. Now, does that mean they were being exploited in the way we might define it today? That's a tricky question, because we have to be careful not to impose modern frameworks too directly onto ancient systems. But what we can say is this: their labor was essential, their control over that labor was limited, and the benefits they received were structured in a way that kept them within the system, which creates a kind of dependency. You rely on the temple for food, for shelter, for stability, and in return, the temple relies on you for labor, for consistency, for maintaining the flow of resources. It's a relationship, but not an equal one, because one side defines the terms. Now, imagine living inside that system, day after day. Your work feeds into something larger, something you don't fully control. You see the results: the stored grain, the finished textiles, the organized distribution of goods. You know you're contributing, but you don't necessarily have a say in how those contributions are used, or how your role might change over time. And that can create a strange feeling, because on one level, you're part of something important, a system that sustains a city, supports religious life, maintains order. But on another level, you're just one part of that system, replaceable, interchangeable, expected to perform your role and keep things moving. And that's where the difficulty comes in, not in the work itself. Work is normal, expected, even necessary, but in the lack of control over how that work fits into your life. Because your labor isn't just something you do. It's something that defines your place, your routine, your future, and stepping outside that structure, again, not easy. So when we talk about why this life might have been hard, this is another piece of the puzzle. It's not just about restriction in behavior or limited movement. It's about being part of an economic system that depends on your labor, while giving you very little control over it. A system that provides stability, but at the cost of independence. A system that functions smoothly, but doesn't leave much room for personal direction. And once you're inside it, it becomes your world. Not temporarily, not casually, but completely. The temple feeds you, clothes you, gives you a role, and in return, it shapes your entire life. Quietly, efficiently, without needing to force anything, because the system itself does the work, and you become part of it. Up to this point, we've talked about structure, rules, work, status, economics, all the things you can see from the outside. But there's another layer to all of this, quieter, harder to measure, and honestly, more important. What did this life actually feel like? Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, not in big, obvious emotions, but in the small, everyday moments. The thoughts you have when no one's watching, the feeling that settles in over time. Because living inside a system like this doesn't just shape what you do, it shapes how you think, how you see yourself, how you understand your place in the world. And that's where things can get heavy. Now, let's start with something simple. Isolation. Not total isolation. Temple life wasn't silent or empty. There were people everywhere. Other women, supervisors, workers, voices, movement, routine. You were rarely physically alone. But emotional isolation, that's different. Because even when you're surrounded by others, you can still feel separate, especially when your life path is so clearly defined. Think about it. You enter the temple young. You leave behind your family maybe gradually, maybe all at once. Either way, that connection changes. You're no longer just someone's daughter. You're part of the temple. And over time, that shift becomes permanent. Your daily interactions are now mostly within the same group, the same people, the same roles, the same expectations. And while you might form friendships, real ones, meaningful ones, your world is still limited, contained. You don't meet new people freely. You don't move between different social circles. You don't experience the variety of life outside those walls. So your emotional world becomes narrower, not empty, but focused, repetitive, and that can create a kind of quiet loneliness, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just sits there in the background. Now, add routine to that, day after day, same schedule, same tasks, same structure. We talked about this before, but here's the psychological side of it. Routine can be comforting, predictable, safe. You know what's coming. You know what's expected. There's no uncertainty, but too much routine, with no variation, no personal choice. That can start to feel numbing, like your days are blending together, not in a dramatic way, just slowly, quietly, until time itself feels a little flat. You wake up, you work, you follow the schedule, you rest, repeat, and at first, maybe that's fine, maybe even reassuring, but over years, that sameness can wear on you, especially if you start to wonder what else could have been. Now, here's another layer. Identity. Because in a system like this, your role isn't just what you do, it's who you are. If you're a priestess, you are defined by that role. If you're a worker, same thing. Your identity is tied to your function, your place in the system, and there's not a lot of room outside of that. You don't get to experiment with different versions of yourself. You don't get to try different paths. You are given a role land. You grow into it, which can feel stable, clear, but also limiting. Because what happens if parts of you don't fit that role perfectly? What happens if you want something different? A different life, a different identity, a different future. Those thoughts don't just disappear. They exist, quietly. Maybe you push them aside. Maybe you don't even fully articulate them, but they're there. And over time, that gap between who you are and who you're expected to be, it can grow. Now, let's talk about belief, because this is important. Many of these women likely believed in the gods they served. Deeply, this wasn't a casual thing. Religion wasn't separate from life. It was the framework of life itself. So when you perform rituals, follow rules, maintain purity, it's not just obligation. It's meaning, purpose, and that can be powerful. It can make difficult things feel worthwhile. It can turn routine into something sacred. It can give structure a sense of importance. But belief also comes with pressure, because if something goes wrong, if a ritual isn't performed correctly, if the city suffers, if there's a bad harvest, there's always that question: did we do something wrong? Did I do something wrong? And when you're part of the system responsible for maintaining divine favor, that question can feel personal, even if it's not. Even if it's just the natural ups and downs of life. The responsibility still feels real. So there's a kind of underlying anxiety. Not constant panic, just awareness that what you do matters a lot, and that getting it wrong could have consequences beyond yourself. Now, combine all of this: isolation, routine, fixed identity, religious pressure, and you start to see the emotional landscape more clearly. It's not dramatic suffering. It's not constant distress. It's something subtler. A slow shaping of the mind. A quiet narrowing of possibilities. A life that feels stable, but also constrained. And here's the thing. Humans adapt. We always do. You find ways to cope. You build connections. You create meaning where you can. Maybe you find comfort in small things. A conversation with someone who understands. A moment of quiet during a ritual that feels genuinely peaceful. A sense of pride in doing your work well. These things matter. They make life livable. But they don't erase the structure. They exist within it. Now, imagine years passing. Then more years. Your routine stays mostly the same. Your role stays mostly the same. The world outside changes, but you experience it from a distance. And at some point, you might start to feel something else. Not just isolation. Not just routine. But a kind of fading. Not physically, but personally. Because when your life is defined by a system for long enough, it can become hard to separate yourself from it. Where do you end, and where does the role begin? That line gets blurry, very blurry, and that can make it difficult to hold on to a sense of individuality, especially when everything around you reinforces the same identity over and over again. Now, to be fair, this isn't unique to temple life. Many structured systems, ancient or modern, can create similar effects. But here, it's intensified. Because the system isn't just social or economic, it's also religious, which means it carries a deeper weight, a sense that this is not just how things are, but how they're supposed to be, and questioning that, not easy, not comfortable, maybe not even safe. So most of the time, you don't question it, you accept it. You live within it. You make the best of it, because that's what people do. But every now and then, in quiet moments, late at night, maybe, when the temple is still, when the routines pause just long enough for your thoughts to wander, you might wonder about the life you didn't choose, the paths you didn't take, the version of yourself that exists somewhere outside these walls. Not in a dramatic, painful way, just quietly, like a thought you don't hold on to for too long, because there's nothing to be done with it. Morning will come. The routine will start again. The role will still be there, waiting, so you let the thought pass. You return to what you know, what's expected, what's required, and life continues. Steady, structured, contained, and from the outside, it all looks normal, functional, even meaningful. But underneath that surface, there's a whole inner world, complex, quiet, and shaped, day by day, by a life that was never entirely your own. There's a strange quietness that settles in when we reach this point, not because the story becomes less important, but because it starts to fade, not in reality, but in the records. Because here's the truth. We don't really know how most of these women's lives ended, and that, in itself, tells you something. Now we've followed them through the system. We've seen how they entered temple life, how they worked, how they lived within rules, expectations, structure. We've looked at power, control, routine, emotion. But when it comes to the final chapter of their lives, history gets vague, because ancient records, especially in places like Mesopotamia, aren't designed to tell personal stories. They record transactions, laws, rituals, property, not inner lives, not quiet endings, not what it felt like to grow older inside a system like this. So what we're left with is fragments, clues, possibilities, and a lot of silence. Now, let's start with what we can piece together. Some high-ranking women, especially those tied to major temples or elite families, may have retained status as they aged. Their roles didn't necessarily disappear overnight. They might have continued overseeing rituals, managing resources, holding a position of respect within the institution. If you've spent decades in the system, rising through its structure, becoming known and established, there's a kind of stability there, a place, an identity that doesn't just vanish. But even then, time changes things. Energy shifts. Responsibilities evolve. New generations come in. And slowly, almost quietly, roles can shift. Less direct involvement. More observation. More distance from the center of daily activity. Which can feel strange, because if your entire identity has been tied to what you do, what happens when you do less of it? Who are you then? Now, for lower-ranking women, the picture is even less clear. There are fewer records, fewer mentions, fewer traces, which likely means their lives continued in the same pattern, work, routine, structure, until they simply couldn't anymore. And then what? That's the part we don't see clearly. Did they remain within the temple, supported by it in old age? Possibly. Temples did provide rations, shelter, structure. It's reasonable to think that long-term members of the system weren't simply cast out without support. But we don't have detailed accounts. No personal stories. No clear descriptions of what daily life looked like in those final years. And that absence is important, because it reflects how history was recorded. Not everyone's story was considered worth preserving, especially not the quiet, ordinary ones. Now, think about that for a second. You live your entire life inside this system. You follow the rules, do the work, maintain the structure, contribute to something larger than yourself. And when your life reaches its later stages, there's no detailed record, no personal account, no voice that carries forward, just silence. That's a kind of ending too. Now, let's talk about memory. Because even if the official records don't preserve these lives, that doesn't mean they weren't remembered. Within the temple, within small circles, among the people who worked together day after day, there were probably stories, shared experiences, memories of who someone was, how they acted, what they were known for. But those memories, they don't travel far. They don't get written down in ways that last thousands of years. They stay local, personal, and eventually, they fade. Now, here's something else to consider. For many of these women, the temple wasn't just where they worked. It was where they lived, where they spent most of, not all of their lives. So their beginning and their ending exist in the same space, the same walls, the same courtyards, the same routines, just at a different pace. There's something both stable and heavy about that, because while stability can be comforting, it also means there's no real transition, no clear next phase, no stepping into a different kind of life, just a gradual shift within the same system. And over time, that can feel like your world is getting smaller. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly. as your role changes, as your energy changes, as the system continues moving around you. Now, let's talk about legacy, because this is where things get a bit complicated. In many societies, legacy is tied to family, children, descendants, a continuation of your line. But for some temple women, especially those in roles that required celibacy, that path wasn't available. No children, no direct lineage. So what does legacy look like then? Work, maybe. The rituals you performed. The system you helped maintain. The people you influenced within the temple. But again, those things aren't always recorded in detail. They exist in the functioning of the institution, not in personal narratives. So your impact is real, but not always visible. Not always remembered in a way that we can trace today, and that creates a kind of quiet disappearance. Not sudden, not dramatic, just gradual. Now, zoom out for a moment. Across centuries, across generations, thousands of women lived these lives, worked in these temples, followed these routines, experienced these structures. And yet, when we look back, we don't see most of them. We see the system, the architecture, the records of goods and laws, but the individuals, mostly gone from the historical picture. And that's not because they weren't important. It's because history, especially ancient history, tends to preserve power. Institutions, leaders, major events, not the everyday lives of people who kept those systems running. So when we reach the end of their stories, we're not just dealing with uncertainty, we're dealing with absence, a gap where personal experience should be. Now, there's something quietly powerful about that, because it reminds us that history isn't complete. It's a reconstruction, a puzzle with missing pieces. And in this case, many of those missing pieces belong to women whose lives were structured, controlled, and essential, but not fully recorded. So what do we do with that? Well, we acknowledge it. We recognize that behind every system we study, there are individual lives we can't fully recover, but we can still understand the structure they lived in, the constraints they faced, the patterns that shaped their experiences. And from that, we can begin to imagine, not invent, but carefully consider what those lives might have felt like, especially at the end. Now, imagine an older woman inside the temple. She knows the routines. She's lived them for years, decades maybe. She moves more slowly now, takes on fewer tasks, watches more than she does. Around her, younger women move through the same patterns she once followed. Same schedules, same expectations, same structure, and she understands it all. Because she's been part of it for so long, there's a kind of familiarity there, maybe even comfort, but also distance, because she knows how it goes, how it continues, how it doesn't really change, and at some point, her role will fade completely, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, like so many things in this system. No big ending, no final moment that gets written down. Just the gradual conclusion of a life lived within a structure that keeps going, with or without you. And maybe that's the hardest part. Not the work, not the rules, not even the lack of choice, but the realization that the system continues, always, and your place within it eventually disappears, without much trace, without much record. Just another life that was lived, fully, quietly, and then gone. Up to now, most of what we've talked about has been controlled, structured, predictable. Even the difficult parts, restriction, routine, pressure, they all exist within a system that's designed to keep things stable. But what happens when that system breaks? Or, more accurately, what happens when someone inside it is seen as breaking the rules? Because no matter how structured a system is, things go wrong. Mistakes happen, people slip, accusations get made. And in a place like Mesopotamia, where religion, law, and daily life are all tightly connected, those moments can get serious very quickly. Now, let's start with something simple. A mistake, not a dramatic one. Just getting something wrong. A ritual performed incorrectly. An offering prepared the wrong way. A schedule not followed exactly. In most modern settings, that might be a small issue. You fix it, you move on. But inside the temple, that mistake carries more weight, because it's not just a procedural error. It's a disruption in the relationship between humans and the gods. At least, that's how it can be seen. And when you're dealing with deities who are believed to influence everything from harvests to health, that's not something people take lightly. So even small mistakes can feel big. Not always punished harshly, but noticed, remembered, added to how others see you. Now, move a step further. Not just a mistake, but a suspicion. Something that doesn't look right. Maybe someone behaves in a way that seems out of line. Maybe there's a rumor, a quiet comment, a look exchanged between two people that gets noticed. And suddenly, it's not just about what happened, it's about what might have happened. And in tightly controlled environments, suspicion can spread fast, because people are always watching, always aware of expectations, always measuring behavior against the rules. So if someone is seen as stepping outside those rules, even slightly, it can become a problem. Now, here's where law comes in. Because Mesopotamian societies had legal systems, detailed ones, and some of those laws, like those found in the Code of Hammurabi, is insight into how behavior was regulated. Not just crime in the modern sense, but social roles, reputation, honor. For temple women, especially those in specific roles, maintaining a certain image wasn't optional. It was required. So accusations of misconduct, whether related to behavior, purity, or breaking expected roles, could have serious consequences. Now, we have to be careful here. Not every accusation led to extreme punishment. Not every mistake resulted in harsh consequences, but the possibility was there, and that possibility shapes behavior. Because when you know that stepping out of line could lead to real consequences, you become more cautious, more controlled, more aware of how you present yourself. Now imagine being in that environment, day after day, not just following rules, but knowing that others are watching for when you don't. That creates a kind of tension. Not loud, not constant panic, but a background awareness. A sense that your actions matter in ways that go beyond just getting your work done. Now, let's talk about more serious situations. Because sometimes, things didn't just stay at the level of suspicion. Sometimes, accusations became formal. And when that happened, the stakes went up. A lot. Depending on the nature of the accusation, consequences could include loss of position, removal from the temple, public shame, or other legal punishments, depending on the context. And here's the difficult part. In a system where your identity is tied so closely to your role, losing that role isn't just a professional setback, it's a complete disruption of your life. If you've spent years, maybe your entire life, inside the temple. Where do you go after that? What do you become? Your skills are tied to the system. Your relationships are tied to the system. Your identity is tied to the system. So being removed from it, that's not just change, that's uncertainty. In a world where uncertainty can be dangerous. Now, here's another layer. Reputation. In Mesopotamian society, reputation matters a lot. It shapes how people see you, how they treat you, what opportunities you have or don't have. And for temple women, reputation is even more tightly controlled, because they're not just individuals. They represent the temple, the god, the system. So if their reputation is damaged, that doesn't just affect them, it reflects on the institution, which means there's even more pressure to maintain it, and even more consequence when it's seen as compromised. Now, let's consider something else. False accusations. Because in any system where reputation is important and behavior is closely monitored, misunderstandings can happen. Bias can play a role. Personal conflicts can influence how situations are interpreted, and once an accusation is made, it can be difficult to undo, especially in a system where authority structures are strong and questioning decisions isn't easy. So even the possibility of being misunderstood, of being judged unfairly, adds another layer of pressure. Another reason to stay within the lines, to avoid risk. To keep your behavior as controlled and predictable as possible. Now, step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. You're living in a system with strict rules, limited freedom, constant expectations, and real consequences for stepping outside those expectations, even accidentally, even slightly. That creates an environment where safety doesn't come from exploration or self-expression. It comes from consistency, from staying within the boundaries, from not drawing attention in the wrong way. And over time, that shapes how people live, how they think, how they move through their daily lives. Because the goal isn't just to do your job, it's to avoid problems, to maintain stability, to stay within the system. Now, again, it's important not to imagine this as constant fear. People still lived, talked, worked, found moments of normalcy, but underneath that normalcy, there's structure, and that structure has consequences, real ones. So when we ask why this life might have been difficult, this is another piece of the answer. It's not just the routine, or the restriction, or the limited choice. It's the stakes. The understanding that stepping outside the system even slightly can have real effects on your life. Effects that are hard to reverse, hard to recover from, and sometimes hard to even fully understand while you're inside it. Because when a system defines everything around you, it also defines what feels possible and what feels dangerous. So most of the time you stay within it, carefully, quietly, doing what's expected, not just because you have to, but because the cost of not doing so is something you can't afford to find out. And that's the reality, far more complex and often far darker than the myths we've been told about temple life in ancient Mesopotamia. It's easy to imagine the past as distant and disconnected, but stories like these remind us that real people lived through these systems with little control over their own lives. And sometimes, the most sacred roles came with the heaviest costs. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it. Really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more.com, thought-provoking history content, and let me know in the comments what part of this surprised you the most. And if you want to keep exploring, Check out the next video on your screen. There's a whole world of hidden history waiting for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.